So in the graph section, we used a multiple baseline design for this intervention, and each participant will be presenting their graph in the order that they started the intervention. I was the first group member to start the intervention, and I did my baseline for 5 days and then started the intervention. So I'll pull my graph up real quick. So during the baseline, I averaged about 7,941 steps, and my baseline was the most stable out of the group, so I began intervention the following workday. I set my long-term goal at 10,000 steps and my first short-term goal at 9,000. I met this goal for 4 out of 5 days and then increased 500 to 9,500. I met this goal for 4 out of 5 days and then increased to 10,000. I met this one for 4 out of 5 days and then went to 10,500. And I met this goal for 3 out of 5 days, so my final goal was set at 11,000. And I met this goal for 4 out of 5 days. I have a half work day every Friday and complete most of my homework during this afternoon. So I sit a lot, and I think that's what most of the dips are from those Fridays. But even though I surpassed my 10,000 step goal in week 3, I decided to continue increasing my steps by the same amount each week. My graph has a positive trend and continues to increase each week. I think that if the intervention would have continued, I would have remained stable at around 11,000. During the last week, I found myself having to pace around to get the last 500 to 1,000 steps. But overall, having goals to meet every day increased my daily step taking, and the next group member to start the intervention was Alicia.
All right, so let me get my graph up here. Okay, so here's my graph. I started baseline, and in baseline, my average step per day was 6,427. So for week 1 goal, I set it at 7,500, which I met 4 out of 5 days. I increased my week goal to 8,500, which I met 3 out of 5 days. For week 3, I set my goal at 9,000, which I met 2 out of 5 days. So week goal was not met and was kept for week 4, which in week 4, I met 1 out of 5 days. During these 2 weeks, there was an increase in meetings and a decrease in client attendance at work, accompanied by me being sick. So my activity level was drastically impacted by those 3 variables. So week 5, I kept my goal at 9,000 as I felt better, and I was hoping that the clients would continue to show up or increase showing at work. During that week, I met 3 out of 5 days, 3 out of 4 days. The intervention ended on the 4th day of the week for me. If we continue the intervention or the study another week, I would have increased to 9,500, which was my total goal for this intervention. And per my continued increase in average daily steps, I believe I would have met this goal, as my end average was 8,595 in intervention. So I went from 6,427 steps per day in baseline to 8,595 steps in intervention. So thank you. Now Sarah will discuss her graph.
Thank you, Alicia. Let me pull my graph up. Okay. On my graph, you will see that my very first day of baseline, I had an extremely low number, and I was wearing one of the clip-on pedometers that was not accurately counting my steps, and it got knocked um, off of my clothes around lunchtime, and so it did not really count steps all afternoon. So the very next day, I swapped to a wrist band, and that monitored my daily steps, and it synced with my cell phone so that I could keep up with steps that way. After that, my steps were pretty regular, and it started to stabilize after a few days. I took baseline for 7 days. After that first day, it peaked the second day because of a field trip, and then it stabilized and was within 500 for 4 of the next 5 days. So after it stabilizing a little bit, I started intervention on day 8. My overall goal for the whole intervention was 11,900 steps. For week 1, my goal was 11,000 steps, and I met that goal all 5 days. So I increased my steps to 11,600 steps on week 2 of intervention, and I met that goal 3 out of 5 days. So I moved on. I was able to increase my steps again on week 3 of intervention, and I set the goal for 11,800 steps. I met my goal that week on 3 out of 5 days, which allowed me to continue to week 4 intervention. For week 4 of intervention, I set my goal for 11,950 steps, which I met 3 out of 5 days, which ended up being higher than my original long-term goal by 50 steps. It got harder and harder to meet my goal as the intervention increased, and I feel like I had a stable baseline, or I had a stable number of steps here, and that if I would have continued to do the intervention, that I really would not have increased. I probably would have decreased. By the end, I was walking laps around the inside of my house trying to get my number of steps. You can tell 3 days in a row where my steps were drastically lower than other days, and those were days that I was in meetings with parents or PST meetings for more than 3 hours, which really made it hard to meet my goal when I was sitting in meetings for 3 hours. The next person we're going to go to is Robin.
All right. Okay, so, oh boy, there's my graph. There we go. Okay, so for me, baseline lasted 10 days due to the variability in my data. I believe that one of the variables that affected my baseline was the number of clients I had a day. During baseline, I had 4 clients for 8 hours a day at work, whereas during the intervention phase, I only had like 2 to 3 clients, so I only had clients for 4 to 6 hours of the day. Once I felt that I had a stable baseline, I did set my goal, my long-term goal for 14,000 steps, and my first week goal was actually set at 13,500. For week 1, I only met criteria 1 out of the 5 days, and so because my steps were so low that week, I decided to decrease my goal for week 2. So week 2, I set my goal at 13,000, but still struggled to meet the goal, but was able to at least meet criterion at 3 out of 5 days. So for week 3, I increased to 13,500 steps. And during that week, I started volleyball. So I had quite a few increases that week. I think one week I actually reached over 17,000 steps. And met criteria in week 3, 3 out of 5 days. And then the final week, I increased my goal to 13,750 and was able to meet criteria in 3 out of 5 days. So although I only met criteria in 3 out of the 4 weeks, I wasn't able to increase my average step count, but I do think that I was still successful through the intervention. I had quite a bit of variability in my graph, but I think overall, like, it was a pretty steady trend. And I think had the intervention continued for me, I hopefully would have gotten to my 14,000 step goal, but it definitely was difficult to get there. If I went to work and had something in the evening, I was able to meet my goal, but it would definitely be something hard to keep up for a long time. So that is my data. And here's Amanda to wrap up the graphs.
Okay, you can see there. Okay, bring it towards there. So for my data, I started with looking at the weeks of my baseline and looking at average per the week. And I took 10% of whatever was going on there and added that on top of it, and that was my criteria. So it was just raising it 10% each time. In the first 10 days is my baseline. Then I lost my pedometer somewhere between 10 and 13. So there's no data available. I had to get a new pedometer, which was a different make than the one before, which is probably somehow contributing to the differences in my steps, but hard to know. So then I started intervention immediately afterwards since I had hit baseline prior. The goals that I had set for myself per week, as I said, were 10% increases. So the first week was 4,068, which I hit. Then it was 4,474 for second week, which I hit again. 4,921 for third, no problem there. And of course, 5,413 was my last one with my ultimate goal of 6,000, which, as you can see from the graph, in general, I probably hit. There are a couple of dips, which due to the fact that my schedule changes with the kiddos, I probably didn't have someone that day, or I had a lot less that day. Maybe we had to shift people around. You also see an increase, which we had a couple of days where I was stuck with 3 or 4 kiddos instead of, say, 1 or 2, which is my usual. So I had a lot more movement going around. And if I'd been stuck with a kiddo that was, or if I'd been placed with a kiddo that was, say, more energetic than my usual, then of course I had to move around a lot more than prior. So that is going to increase or going to contribute to the increase in my steps there. Overall, it worked. I probably would end up going up to something like 6,000 would be my technically next goal if I were to do a 10%, somewhere around there. And I don't think it would be a problem hitting that sort of thing. Okay, so once I figure out how to do this. There we go. Okay. So for the discussion part of this, the first thing, and I think this is just the obvious fantastic move into from what I just talked about, pedometers, they were all different. So that's going to contribute to your differences in your data. Whether or not a pedometer, first of all, is accurate or valid, that isn't really easy to answer because there's not a lot of data available already. And since they're all made differently, some are more sensitive, some are less sensitive, that's going to contribute to the changes in data. So some people are going to have better data, some people have worse data. It's hard to tell. And if in an optimal situation, you would want everyone to have the same pedometer. That way you can keep a tighter control on the steps and make sure that, within your capability, keep it as objective and concise as possible. The second part of that is the fact that we are at distances, so it's really hard to keep track of all the data and making sure that, the pedometers themselves are being accurate, or we're being accurate, or, whatever, right? So that is something to always keep in mind whenever you're doing a long distance or any sort of research that connects via digital media. There's always that possibility. We're human after all. Humans are terrible organisms. The other thing to keep in mind is the fact that we are all of varying ages and physical activity levels. So some are going to be more inclined to physical activity and some are less inclined. That's going to also change how things work, especially if we're looking at whether someone hit criteria or they didn't. Someone who's already excessively physically active, it's going to be really hard to hit a criteria that's even higher, because you do have that period, that point where organisms are going to hit that you just can't get any higher due to things like, sleeping and just resting and that sort of thing, or maybe your job and that sort of thing like that. Whereas those of us who are in the lower criteria, we can usually pump it up a little bit more without too much difficulty. So it's going to be easier for us to hit it. So whether or not the intervention, you have to keep that in mind, because it may or may not be the intervention. If we're talking about people who generally are very physically active, they just might inherently walk more. Just that's just what they do. Whereas those of us who don't walk quite as much, it might actually be beneficial. So there's that to keep in mind. And as I said, we're at different age categories and different physical activities. The ages is important just for the simple fact that age matters in physical capabilities, and so that could always affect your data. In future research, what would be really interesting to look at are the differences in sexes, just because you do tend to see females tend to take on a lot of caregiver roles, especially in the mental health setting. We might just inherently walk more. So you might see a discrepancy in males and females to increase their steps. You might see it's more difficult for women just because we inherently walk more, whereas men, it might be easier because they're men. Anyway, so the other thing is just the geographical locations. Since we did do this from morning to night, that is going to shift your time a little bit. I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference, but there is always that to consider. Let's see what we've got here. I think that's pretty much all we've got for that. The research is pretty good when it comes to the efficacy of these types of interventions, but it's still a bit sparse. So it's something that we could definitely do better. We could do more research on it, especially with pedometers, just making sure that the pedometers are accurate and are valid, so that if we are doing research with them, we're making sure that our data is as good as we can get it, instead of relying on, simple technology to tell us whether or not something's working. All right, there we go.
Thank you for watching our video. Although only 4 out of 5 of the participants were able to meet their long-term goal, our data does show that setting goals, self-monitoring, and feedback can increase physical activity through increasing daily step counts.